San Francisco, 1967. The corner of Fillmore and Geary. From the outside, it was plain brick, a marquee that needed repainting, a line of people wrapping around the block in the November cold. Inside, it was something else entirely. Posters covered every wall, psychedelic and electric, names bleeding into color. The ceiling felt low when the room was full. The floor vibrated before anyone touched a string. That night, the room was full. Jefferson Airplane had been on the bill for weeks. Their name was at the top, San Francisco's name. Grace Slick had made sure of that, not with contracts or negotiations, but with something simpler and harder to argue with. She had made Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, and those two songs had done something to the country that most bands spent entire careers trying to do. She was 27 years old and she walked into the Fillmore that evening the way a person walks into a room they own. She did not own it, but nobody was going to tell her that. Backstage was narrow and loud with the particular noise of people pretending to be calm. Equipment cases against the walls, cables everywhere, the smell of cigarette smoke and something sweeter underneath. Grace stood near the back corridor with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, listening to someone from the crew talk about the lineup. Jimi Hendrix Experience, closing the show. She knew the name. London had decided he was important, and London's opinion traveled fast in 1967. She had heard the record. Are You Experienced? Listened to it twice. Once to understand what people were talking about. Once because the first time had not fully resolved. He's good, she said, to no one specifically. The crew member looked up. She didn't add anything. The sentence was already complete. Jefferson Airplane took the stage at 9:30. Grace walked out into the light and the room came to meet her. The crowd did not wait for her to reach them. They moved toward her in sound, in attention, in the particular electricity of a San Francisco audience that had claimed this band as their own. She gripped the microphone and felt the familiar thing settle into place, the thing that told her she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Somebody to Love opened the set. By the second verse, the Fillmore was doing what it did when everything was working. It stopped being a room and became something else, a single breathing thing. Grace had learned to control it, to read when the crowd was hers and when she was losing them, to adjust without showing the adjustment. Tonight she did not adjust once. White Rabbit closed the set. The bass line came in and the room tensed with recognition, that specific anticipation of a song people love being played live for the first time or the 50th. Grace let the tension hold a beat longer than felt comfortable. Then she released it. The last note faded. The Fillmore erupted. She stood still at the microphone and looked out. 500 faces turned up toward her, most of them already committed to the memory they were making. She had done this, built it from nothing but her voice and the band behind her, and the specific gravity she carried when she walked into a room. She stepped back. She did not bow. She never bowed. Walking off stage, she passed the guitar tech going the other direction with a different instrument in his hands. A white Stratocaster. She didn't stop. Backstage again. The narrow corridor. The noise. Someone handed her a towel. The band was coming off behind her, talking in the compressed shorthand of people who had just finished a show that went well and knew it. Grace leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. You heading out? She opened them. Paul Kantner, guitar still around his neck, looking at her with the expression he used when he already knew the answer. In a minute more, she said. He moved past her toward the exit. On the other side of the wall, she could hear the crew finishing the changeover, the thud of equipment being repositioned, voices calling out measurements, the specific quality of quiet that comes just before a different kind of noise. She didn't move. She told herself it was because her feet hurt. She told herself several things in quick succession, and none of them were entirely false, and none of them were the reason. The lights through the gap in the curtain changed. Jimi Hendrix walked past her in the corridor, not quickly, not slowly. He had the white Strat on a strap over his shoulder, already strung around him like it had been there all day. He didn't look at her, not dismissively, not pointedly, simply the way a person doesn't look at someone they haven't been introduced to in a hallway. He walked through the curtain and onto the stage. Grace stayed where she was. The tuning took longer than she expected. She could hear it from the corridor. The careful, unhurried process of getting each string exactly right. Not performing the tuning, actually doing it. Notes came out individually, hung in the air, came back slightly closer to whatever he was hearing in his head. The crowd waited. She found herself listening. That was the first thing she registered as unusual. The act of a man tuning his guitar was holding her attention. She had watched hundreds of guitarists tune up. It was the dead time before the music started. You looked at your set list, talked to whoever was next to you, thought about what you wanted to eat after the show. She was not thinking about what she wanted to eat. The tuning stopped. A beat of silence. Then the first chord. It came out of the Fillmore speakers, and it was not loud the way she had expected. It was precise. It landed in the center of the room with an intentionality she recognized from her own work. The difference between a sound that happens and a sound that is placed. This was placed. She moved to the gap in the curtain. She told herself she would watch for 2 minutes. He played Purple Haze first. She knew the song. On the record, it was fast, aggressive, interesting. Live It was different, not because the structure had changed, but because the record had not prepared her for what it looked like from 10 feet away. His hands. She was a vocalist. She had played guitar, but she was not a guitarist, and she watched his hands with the attention of someone who understood enough to know how much they didn't understand. The bend on the third note of the intro, the way his thumb came over the top of the neck, the angle of his wrist which should not have worked and produced a sound that absolutely worked. The crowd was moving, not the way they had moved for her. Her crowd moved in waves in the back and forth of a performer and an audience in conversation. This crowd was moving differently. They were not responding. They were being pulled. The distinction mattered to her. She had spent years learning to pull a crowd, and she knew what it looked like. And this was it. And she was standing on the wrong side of the curtain, watching it happen. She did not move for 2 minutes. She did not move for 20. The solo in the middle of the set, she could not have said which song it came from, lasted a long time and contained almost no wasted notes. She had heard virtuosity before. She had sat through guitarists playing scales at tremendous speed and felt nothing in particular. Speed was not the point. She knew that. What was happening on that stage was not speed. It was something she did not immediately have a word for. She stood in the corridor trying to find it, while the Fillmore shook around her and 500 people forgot they were in a building. The closest she could get was certainty. He played with a certainty about where every note was supposed to go, not because he had rehearsed the destination, but because he was finding it in real time and trusting it completely. She trusted her voice. She had built everything on that trust. She watched him trust his hands the way she trusted her voice, and she understood something she was not sure she wanted to understand. The solo resolved. The crowd made a sound she had not heard them make tonight. Not applause, not excitement. The sound of something involuntary. The sound people make when they have not chosen to react. She stepped back from the curtain. She was sitting on an equipment case when Paul found her. He came back through the rear entrance with his jacket on. He stopped when he saw her face. "I thought you left," he said. "I was about to." He looked at her for a moment without comment, waiting. She didn't add anything. Through the wall, the applause was not stopping in the normal way. It was accumulating. "How was it?" Paul said. Grace looked at the wall, at the gap in the curtain where the stage light was still falling through. She said something, quietly without looking at him. He heard it. He didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he nodded once, picked up his guitar case, and walked to the exit without saying anything else. She did not talk about that night for a long time. Through 1968 and 1969, when journalists asked about the San Francisco scene in the Fillmore, Grace gave answers that were interesting enough to print. She talked about the band, about Haight-Ashbury, about what it meant to front a rock group in an industry that had specific ideas about where women belonged on a stage. She did not mention a Tuesday night in November 1967 when she stood in a backstage corridor, watched through a gap in a curtain, and did not leave when she told herself she was going to leave. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. She heard the news the way most people in the music world heard it. A phone call, a voice saying something that took a moment to process. She made no public statement. She did not speak at any of the memorial events. She went quiet for a few days. People who knew her attributed it to the general shock of that period. The deaths were accumulating. Janice the same month. The list nobody wanted to keep adding to. In 1989, a journalist came to interview Grace about Jefferson Airplane's legacy. They sat in her kitchen for 3 hours. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, the journalist asked, "Is there a performance you witnessed, not your own, that you've never been able to get out of your head?" Grace looked out the window. "Fillmore West," she said. 1967. The journalist waited. "Jimi Hendrix. I watched his set from the side of the stage." A pause. "We headlined that night. I came off feeling exactly the way you want to feel after a show, like I had done what I came to do, and the room confirmed it." She stopped. "Then he played." "What did you think?" the journalist asked. Grace turned back from the window. "I thought, I take the stage with my voice. I built everything I have on knowing how to use it." She was quiet for a moment. "He took the stage with something I don't have a name for. Not technique, not charisma. Something underneath both of those things. And the room knew the difference. That same room I had just held. It knew immediately, and it went somewhere I couldn't follow." She reached for her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about that for 22 years. I still don't know what it was. I just know I was standing right there, and I felt it, and I couldn't argue with it." The journalist wrote it all down. Grace did not add anything else. Outside the window, the afternoon light came through at a low angle, shadows starting earlier than you'd expect. She held the cup and said nothing more about that night. She had said enough. The room had known the difference. That was the whole story.